Hello, everyone. Glad to see you all here. I'm just going to add one little clarification to my position here at Fort Lewis College. I have a joint appointment in anthropology and with the Anthropology Department and the Environment and Sustainability Department. And so I've been working here full-time since 2010 and helped to build the majors in the Environment and Sustainability Department. Originally it was called Environmental Studies major. And I'm a Fort Lewis grad. All right, so once I get going, I'll probably loosen up a little nervous. I don't think I've ever even been on a stage like this. But I'm happy you're all here, and especially students. Hopefully they came for the interest level as well as the potential assignment you can use this for. So I have to confess I used AI a little bit on my title. It was I was on sabbatical for 8 months, and Christina started emailing me, I think around November, about getting the title that she could put into marketing. And so Bridging Worlds, AI helped me with that. I was looking for something that would look at the idea of working between different cultures. And so that's what we came up with. And I am trained as an environmental anthropologist. So I work with humans regarding environmental issues. So here's a bridge, Bridging Worlds. This is in Scotland. It's actually taken from a TV show I like, All Creatures Great and Small. And you'll see the connection to Scotland a little bit later. This is my family. And like Christine said, I don't usually show baby pictures at a professional conference, but there is me in there. So there's only 2 of us left in my family. That is one of my brothers, and that is my father, who was from the Philippines, and that's in his cadet training uniform. My father died before I was born, so I never knew him, and my mom and my other brother. Okay, this is a fun part. So I went to this experimental high school. I grew up in the outskirts of Washington, D.C., and it was very multicultural. All my neighborhoods where I grew up, I was in the same house for 12 years. We had Vietnamese, Japanese. My family is, my mother's side of the family is Jewish, and all kinds of different people that I went to school with. Then it turns out I ended up going to a high school. It was a public high school. And I decided to look up, like, what was that really called? Because I found a name for it in a video I was showing to an anthropology class one time. They called it a demonstration school. Well, actually, we called it an experimental school. No school bells, broad lesson plans, innovative class subjects, pass-fail grading, an 8-period day with 1 free period during the day, and optional attendance. And honestly, it was not just in some classes. Attendance was optional all across the board. And I will promise you, I did not love high school. So we were hanging out doing other stuff, if you get my drift. This was I went to high school in the mid-1970s around the Washington, D.C. area. And it was very influential to me because that was a time of counterculture, protest, anti-Vietnam, and environmental protests. And you might wonder, what were we protesting? We were protesting pollution. The National Environmental Policy Act had not even been passed, or had just barely been passed around that time. So something important to think about, this was my first experience going to Appalachia, which is an area in the eastern United States that covers about 7 or 8 states, but our teacher in high school actually had a little grant, and she took us to Appalachia to study the devastating effects of strip mining and deep mining on the cultures in West Virginia and Kentucky primarily. So that was my first exposure to going to Appalachia and learning about the culture. It was a cultural anthropology class. That's where I had my first cultural anthropology classes. And I had gone and liked to go camping and went camping around the Shenandoah Mountains in Virginia, but I did not know anything about that culture. We had that, I had that experience and managed to get through high school. I ended up graduating a year early because it was innovative and I didn't really like school very much, so I just got out of there and came west. But my favorite thing was this trip to Appalachia. This presentation is being filmed. I hope that my high school teacher, Joyce, can see it. I'm going to send it to her son, who's a retired professor. Joyce is 97 now, so I'm going to send him that link, and hopefully she'll be able to see it. And thank you, Joyce, for everything. So for today, I'm going to talk about applied research. And what applied anthropology means is that we use any or all the subdisciplines, in my case, primarily cultural anthropology, any or all the subdisciplines for problem solving in the real world. And I'm also trained as an environmental anthropologist, which means that the issues that I tend to look at are environmentally related. One of the big differences in what I do and what some other anthropologists do, and most of the other anthropologists here at Fort Lewis, is I do consulting and shorter term projects. And so I don't always pick the project that I'm going to work on. Sometimes a client will pick me, or I had a company for 5 years also with a colleague. It was called Applied Cultural Ecology. So for today, I'm just going to note some of my key fieldwork experiences and 3 or 4 other projects, including my long-term research, doctoral research in the Philippines, where I did pick the topic. And then I'm going to focus the rest of the time on Appalachia, my recent work in the last 10 years in Appalachia, where people have been fighting a pipeline there for 10 years. The pipeline has been built. We thought they were going to win, but it ended up being built anyway. And it's an unknown story throughout the world. It hasn't made the news. Actually, The Guardian is a newspaper from the United Kingdom. They've covered it a few times, but it just really hasn't made national or international news much. So I'm going to spend quite a bit of time talking about that. So in my work, you're going to see this phrase, I talk to people, but that's mostly what I do. I have certain methods for how I ask questions, how I come up with the questions I might ask them. There's things where you can ask people to draw. There's different ways you can analyze the data. But basically, I talk to people. So applied anthropology, I mentioned, we try to be problem solving. And then this idea of cultural broker, it's actually a very, very old term. I've been doing anthropology for many decades, so sometimes I get worried teaching that I'm using an old term that isn't like a PC kind of a thing anymore, but I just used an article in one of my classes, and it turns out cultural broker is still being used as a term in applied anthropology. So that's the idea of going between worlds. So in my work, you're going to see that with each example that I give you, where I'm going between different worlds, and that's where the bridging worlds comes from in the title. And it is the practical use of anthropology. Usually I use unstructured ethnographic methods. And I like to say ethnographic because it's not just qualitative, okay? There's a slight or major difference there. So how do we know? When I say ethnographic, talk to the people, one of the biggest difference between ethnographic, which was developed by anthropologists over 100 years ago, is the idea of inductive reasoning. You're learning from a situation. In biology, you call it in situ, right? The people are in situ. They're in their own environment. So we're not going in with a deductive question, or I'm not. Some anthropologists do that type of work, and I could if I needed to. But I go in with a broader question from the beginning and work our way from the inside out to learn from people's stories, people's lives, and so on. And so I'll be able to show you an example about that. We may have some more specific things that we do ask when we go in because of the field being client-based. If a client wants something done, then you have to kind of talk to your client and say, well, maybe we need to ask certain kind of questions that are more open-ended so we can learn from people. We talk to the people no matter what. So I'm going to talk about these 3 shorter-term projects. They're not in order. And so these are the short ones. I'm just going to show you one slide on each, and then I'll talk about the Philippines, and then we'll be talking about Appalachia the rest of the time. So my job, I got my master's degree from Northern Arizona University, and the first job I had was working in Alaska on the social impacts, the Exxon Valdez oil spill. I interviewed people in the city of Kodiak Island and in 6 native villages on the island of Kodiak about the effects of the oil spill on their lives and on their ability to practice their traditional and subsistence practices. Okay, I've also worked on the Navajo Nation, helping to set up a system to identify and protect traditional and sacred places across the Navajo Nation. This is an image of an old enemy way site, and it's along a road system, which we are trying to protect sites that might be impacted by development of the roads along the reservation, which the people wanted. They wanted improved roads, but they also wanted to protect their tradition. So, cultural broker between the Dene, or Navajo people, and the road construction engineers, actually. More recent project, African American homesteading in the Mojave Desert. And when I had, one of the things that applied anthropologists have to deal with sometimes is they don't always pick the topic. So I think I said that, but so I would have never thought that I would be researching African American homesteading in the desert in the early 1900s. But I did have this side consulting business with a colleague, and we were asked to do this work, and it's called ethnohistory, where you're trying to find out not just the key figures and dates, but how a group of people lived and what was going on with their homesteading the early 1900s. These were some homesteaders that, descendant communities that I met, and that was the only homesteading picture. You can barely see it, but it's the only homesteading picture of people on the land. That was one of their grandfathers. And so the National Park Service uses that material for interpretive materials in the Mojave National Conservation Area. Okay, so my doctoral work in the Philippines, I was studying coastal environmentalism in Palawan. I was there for 14 months, and the work was funded by a Fulbright grant. And I was studying community-based resource management. So I lived in a fishing village for half the time, and I lived in my nice house in town on the island of Palawan, a city called Puerto Princesa, the other half. And I was interviewing environmentalists, Filipino educated environmentalists, and local fisherfolk, and what was happening with the relationship between the two. The environmentalists were trying to help the local fisherfolk. They were very social justice oriented. Here's an image of the bay where I got to live. I did stay in the hut in the fishing village with no electricity and no running water for part of the time. And then talking to the people. This happens to be my aunt, my great aunt that I was able to meet there in the Philippines. And then this is actual field work in the village, talking to some of the people who live there and doing interviews and cleaning fish. So, like I said, I was studying this environmental movement and what educated Filipinos were doing to help local fisherfolk to restore their coastal environments. The fisherfolk in those villages loved that I was there because I was talking to them. They knew I was from America, and they're like, "You come all the way here, you want to talk to me?" And actually, they knew a little bit. Philippines has a very high level of education. They knew a little bit about anthropology and indigenous peoples. And the people I talked to had been colonized, and they were what overall anthropologists used to call a peasant class. They were just very poor people that were mixed, living landless along these coastal areas. And so I worked out a introduction that was in Tagalog, which is supposed to be the Philippine main languages, but a lot of Filipinos speak other languages there. And I did have a research assistant who was trilingual, and he was male, so that helped. He was younger, so that helped with the men. But once I was able to sort of put together my little script, and then I would say that to them in Tagalog, they totally understood it. So I don't know if people remember, but when President Obama was in office, he talked about natural gas as a bridge fuel before we go into our major green energy transition. And so the idea for this pipeline, which is called the Mountain Valley Pipeline, was that they were going to build this pipeline, and it was during that period, and it was approved because of the idea of it being a bridge fuel. But the problem is, it was going to go through some really beautiful, pristine lands where people had farms, had homes, had peace and quiet, had beautiful, clean water, and they didn't want it there. So I ended up on this project because the pipeline company had this environmental contracting company, environmental compliance company, and they found the company that my partner and I, my research partner and I had. It was called Applied Cultural Ecology. And the company was based out of Nevada. And the people living in this area had what they called cultural attachment to place. And so they started protesting that this pipeline should not be able to be built because they had cultural attachment to the whole area. And the reason that they did that was because they had been able to fight out some power lines in the 1990s based on this idea of cultural attachment to the land. And they won. And so they thought that they had these rights because they won this other project against it. And so those power lines were never built. So they were at these public meetings that were required under the environmental impact statement. And they started screaming, this was very unusual, we want anthropologists. I mean, hardly anybody ever does that, right? So they wanted a chance to tell their story. And they thought they had rights. They thought they had rights to keep the pipeline out. But it turns out, actually, it wasn't because of the law that they were able to keep the earlier power lines out. It was because they had a sympathetic Forest Service supervisor. And so, I mean, for those of you that watch TV or you have friends in the legal system, I mean, you have to see who is your lawyer going to be, who's the judge going to be, how's the law going to be interpreted, what is the precedent, and so on. So the Mountain Valley Pipeline company had their contractor hire our company, Anthropologists. And it wasn't a thing where we had to bid on it or anything. They just called around, they looked around, and we had to be vetted very seriously. They called a bunch of references on my research partner and I, Ginny Bengtson. And I have a copy of that report. I think Christine put it outside. If anybody wants it, it's paper. But they insisted that, we want anthropologists. You need to get some cultural anthropologists. Bring them over here. So we went. Okay, this is what the area looks like. And it's actually maybe 2 to 3 hours east of some of the areas where I went when I was in high school that were devastated by strip mining and deep coal mining. And this area has a very different geology under the ground, and there's not that type of coal, there's neither type of coal, and these people in the region have lived in this area for a couple hundred years. They have families that have, each family has about 5 acres. There's a lot of organic farms and so on. And some of you may be wondering about, well, what about the Native Americans? These are poor whites living in this area now. There were Native Americans in this area as long ago as 16,000 years before present. They were Siouan, which is Sioux as in the Sioux in the plains areas, the Dakotas in the west. But the Siouan Native Americans were originally from these areas in Appalachia. But between 1491 and 1620, 90% of the human population died out in North and South America. We now know that as fact. There is research that supports that, and that's gradually becoming known as fact. So by the time that the Scottish immigrants who were religiously oppressed in their home country, by the time the Scottish, also Irish, came to the area, there were not Native Americans there at that time. And so these were people, poor whites that had been oppressed in their home countries, and they came over and migrated and settled primarily in between 1720 and 1760. And they have a very strong attachment to their land. Currently, we call this sense of place. Most places do refer to it as sense of place. But there had been a previous anthropologist that helped them win against those power lines in the past, and they were using that phrase, cultural attachment. So this company wanted us to determine if cultural attachment was a real thing or not. So that was our job. And we said, yes. It doesn't matter if you haven't ever heard of it before, and it's not in the literature. So I combed the literature. It was actually really interesting. Cultural attachment currently refers to someone's attachment to their family. It's a social work and psychology term. So it normally doesn't really mean the same thing that it means in this area of Appalachia. But there was a sociologist and there was one anthropologist. She was at Radford University in Virginia, and she had 7 different classes go through some of these areas and do some of this research documenting people's cultural attachment to the land, how they lived, cultural attachment to land and water. So this is just an example of a historic cabin. It's being rented out as a VRBO by one of the families that we interviewed. Here are some quotes about their attachment to the land. There's some geographic formation. You wouldn't call it a mountain here. It's like a big long ridge. It's called Peters Mountain. And they call it the mountain that roars because there's a geologic kind of phenomena that happens when the wind comes across and it hits that ridge, and it sounds like no other sound. It's like it's talking, but it's roaring. So they liken the land to a family member, and they also give it spiritual essence. For those of us who call Peters Mountain home, it's a very rare and special place where the mountain watches over us. It is sacred. It provides both peace and protection. Its power is not to be disrupted casually. So I also analyzed letters that landowners had written, because there had been hundreds of written protests to this pipeline as well. So that was a quote from that, one of the letters that the landowners had written. Cultural attachment, we determine, is sense of place. Not everybody uses the phrase cultural attachment, but people all over the world have a very strong sense of place depending on which cultural group. So it isn't just indigenous people that have those kinds of attachments. There's no determination as to how many years you would need to have that kind of attachment, but people in this area had family ties over a course of 6 or 7 generations and sometimes up to a couple hundred years. So we talked to the people. And you can see the recording device in the middle there. That's also one of our methods. We sat up in this house for an afternoon and talked to these 3 sisters and got their story. And they were part of the protest against the original power line plans in the 1990s. And it was really interesting because one of the things people were really worried about was their water source. And I showed a picture of a little stream a minute ago, and I'm going to show you some more about the water source. But basically, this area, these mountains geologically have this huge formation underneath, which is called karst with a K, K-A-R-S-T. And there's all this water under there, and you don't know where it's going to and where it might come out. It's like Swiss cheese underground. That's how it's described. And so they were very worried about their water system because many of these families, there's no municipal water system. The counties don't have municipal water systems out to these areas. And you would think they'd have to have a well, but they don't even have a well, and I'll show you how that works. So here's water just coming right out of the side of the mountain. It's not a great picture, but I was just driving by my one of the valleys in my car and took that picture. Now this is what's called a spring box, okay? And so when I was sitting with these sisters in that house for the afternoon, because of my training as an environmental anthropologist, I wanted to know exactly what they meant. Because people would just say, oh, well, our water, you know, the pipeline. So I would say, well, what do you mean? Where do you get your water? And they'd say, it's up on the hill. And I'm like, well, how do you get it here, you know? And they said that they had this pipe that was fed into their house. And I said, well, do you need a filter or anything? And they said, well, we just get one at Home Depot. So basically, it comes through this spring box, and I found a diagram that shows underground what it would look like. And it's sort of filtered in there by a screen, and that's about it. And then it goes to, the pipe goes all the way down. It looks like a hose. It goes all the way down to their house. And it's gravity fed. Here's a quote about water protectors. And this is an example of just how worried they were. People, the pipeline company was saying, you can't just fix it. And our client was a very large environmental consulting company, and they said the same thing. They said, oh, well, we'll just dig them a new well. And so I have a photo, it's not in here, of the actual pipe. It's a hose, it's really a hose. It's like a rubber hose, and it comes down from a gradually sloping mountain. But they took us up there, and they would have never taken us up there if I wasn't just sitting there chatting with them, right? And I said, well, where is it? And they said, well, do you want to go? So we went and we took a walk. And it was kind of far to hike up there. It was like, I don't know, 1/8 of a mile or something. And it goes all the way down the mountain into their house. So when I talked to the client mid-project, before we wrote up the report, I said, well, they're really worried about their water. And she said, well, it's not like they just stick a hose in the ground. And I said, actually, it kind of is, you know? So I made sure I put all that in the report. And there were geologists that also warned about drilling in this area, that it would disrupt the karst, the underground system. So I want to go back to this picture of the house for a minute. So this little house that 4 of us are standing in front of us is where we sat and did this interview with these sisters. And I kept wondering, because that whole afternoon we spent with them, we hiked up the mountain and we came back and we were back in the house again. And I kept wondering who lived there. We knew it was their parents' house. So finally it was sort of the end of the day, and I was like, you know, which one of you has this house now? Who lives here? And they said, nobody lives here. And I said, well, where do you live? Why not? It's called the home place. It's their home place. It's their parents' house. And they keep the house alive. They keep it going. They don't rent. They don't rent to outsiders. They pay to keep the electric on. And these are poor people. So it's very, very important to keep all of their traditions going. And it would be highly unlikely that they would ever rent that house out. So the pipeline was built. We thought they were going to win against the construction company, but I took students there in 2023 because I had been following the story, and there were people protesting, there were people living in trees, and they almost had it shut down. They had cited them for multiple violations, but the summer of 2023, when we came back, about a month after the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, and there's a senator from West Virginia, his name's Joe Manchin, and he's the most conservative of all the Democrats, and so he tacked on amendments to the Inflation Reduction Act that the government would expedite all permits for the Mountain Valley Pipeline. And this is not about our current administration. This was all going on under other administrations, under Democratic administrations. So the pipeline was built. The people living in the area have also allied with indigenous Native Americans, and they've joined forces to fight the pipeline. They filed declarations and complaints with the United Nations. And this is what it looks like as the pipe's on top before it's laid. So it was just sitting on top waiting for the final approval for many years. Here are some students that I took in 2023. And here is me and one of my students, Marissa. She was not able to be here today, doing some interviews, participatory mapping, and having one of our interviewees point out some places of concern. Here is Marissa and Maggie. Maggie's going to come up shortly. She is a staff here at Fort Lewis, former student. And Maury Johnson, our host. So Maury Johnson made much of this possible. He's a retired history professor, history teacher, and he's and principal, and a very, very serious activist to protect these lands. And so he's given Maggie and Marissa a lesson. So this is what it looks like as they're trying to build it. And you can see they're trying to hold the mountain back. It's a 300-mile pipeline that's 42 inches. And none of the gas goes to any of these communities. It goes to other stations where it's distributed elsewhere. So it does go through the mountains in the Appalachians. It's an environmental injustice because it goes through some of the poorest areas. These are pipeline opponents, and they would rotate in these tree sits. It's the longest continuous tree sit that I know of, like ever, that's happened in the world. But they would rotate. It wasn't just one person. They did finally get removed, I think about 2 years ago. There are people strapping themselves to bulldozers, major protests, people getting arrested, and so on. Also, FERC is called the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and they are exempted from a lot of the regular environmental procedures. And so this person was saying they hate FERC more for granting eminent domain, which means taking people's lands. So there has been this loss of trust in the overall idea of public participation because people went to all these meetings. And it was really what this other author that's been working on this topic calls performative participation. So whether or not you actually really do anything is the other side of it. And it has caused harm to the public. One of the things that we found out when we went back, I just went back for my sabbatical project last November, and Maggie was with me and Marissa, is that one of the big effects that's happened to people in the region is not only water, because that's still being revealed, but it's access to their lands, because people hunt, farm, hike, move around. The way they move around on the land is really different than you might think. They don't stick to just one person's private land. Everybody knows whose each other's land is. And now that there's this pipeline going through, even though it's buried and if they're allowed to go on it, they're afraid to go across it because of just fear of accidents or whatever. This is what it looks like. I was thinking, since we have wildlife crossings on roads, why not have human crossings throughout these mountains on these pipelines? We told the company that there is no mitigation for cultural attachment, but if you had to mitigate somehow how people move around on their land, maybe you could put some bridges in, and it would restore this idea of the right to roam, which is actually a new tradition now. That it's an old tradition that's being revived, of saying people should have the right to roam, but it is a Scottish tradition, and they probably brought it with them from Scotland over a couple hundred years ago. So basically, conclusions: we need to save the National Environmental Policy Act. We need to strengthen it. We need to save the National Historic Preservation Act. And there are no provisions for people's environmental health, which is physical and mental health, being affected by this pipeline. Also, it's an environmental injustice because these are poorer people than others in their state. People are reaching exhaustion and contracting physical illnesses. The Natural Gas Act itself is unconstitutional. It says you can take people's land. Here are just a few more slides. Her t-shirt says Granny Pipeline Fighter. It's a very nice family that hosted us when we were there in 2023. We stayed at their house, and the husband was a chef. He cooked these huge meals for us. This is when they thought they were going to win, so they had, like most places we went, they had parties for us, so we could meet people and talk to them, and then also just they were very motivated about the fight. I feel like in the end, it's also about bridging community. A lot of these people have gotten to know others in their next county over. People in this area identify with the county where they live. So they've made some really great alliances. And this is actually a covered bridge that's in a historically designated site in one of the communities. And so I think I probably am just going to end there.